First of all, I want to thank Magda and everyone from the Jagiellonian University who came up with the idea for this project and worked to make this happen. Really huge congratulations. This is an amazing and I think much needed project, which I'm sure will contribute greatly to the development of the study of disability. Inviting me to organize. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with all of you today. Before I comment briefly on the title of today's conversation and before I introduce our wonderful panelists, I just want to say a few words about Ukraine. At the same time, I need to admit that it's difficult because I'm a little bit lost what to say. The situation is heartbreaking. At the same time, I live in Warsaw, where, as you know, thousands of refugees are arriving every day, including those with disabilities. And today, during our conversation, when we talk about disability studies and disability activism, I would also like us to think together collectively, also during Q&A, what does disability studies, what does disability activism offer us, and how can it help us, if at all? And now going to the title. So by Cripping Eastern Europe, I mean simply looking at Eastern Europe through disability lens, right? I think it's important because disability experiences, identities, histories have been ignored, neglected, or silenced in the study of Eastern Europe. And I am interested both today and also in my own research in analyzing what does thinking with and through disability tell us about Poland and Eastern Europe. I'm interested in thinking how does disability modify, nuance, and possibly redefine our understandings of Eastern European histories, cultures, literatures, experiences. And I am really happy that Svetlana, Kateřina, Ina, and Monika agreed to join me today in this collaborative thinking and discussion. And so Svetlana Borodina is a Mellon Teaching Fellow at the Harriman Institute and lecturer in anthropology at Columbia University in the United States. And currently she studies post-Soviet cultures and politics of disability inclusion in Russia. Ina Dimitrova is an associate professor in social philosophy and bioethics at the Department of Philosophy and History at the University of Plovdiv in Bulgaria. Her current research is focused on disability activism, disability history, and history of the sciences in the socialist context. Monika Dubiel is a PhD student at the Faculty of Artes Liberales at the University of Warsaw in Poland. She's working on the doctoral dissertation in the field of disability studies, and she focuses on the topic of visually impaired artists in Mexico. And last but not least, Kateřina Kolářová is a researcher at the Center for Gender and Science at the Institute of Sociology of the Czech Academy of Sciences, and she teaches gender studies. She teaches gender studies at the Faculty of Humanities at Charles University in Prague, Czech Republic. And currently she's exploring issues of microbiopolitics and larger than human environmental communities. Thank you for being here today. And I would like to start by asking you a question. Actually, these are two interconnected questions. So what brought you to the study of disability? And how does disability operate in your research? By the way, should I also turn off my camera? Because literally everyone turned off their cameras with that, except for me. Okay, I assume the panelists can have their cameras on. That's my that would be my assumption.
Yeah, that would be great if all of you have your cameras on.
So yeah, so I'm coming back. So I'm repeating my question of this chaos. So what brought you to the study of disability and how does disability operate in your research? And I would like each of you to respond. I don't know who wants to start? We can go in an alphabetical order for in the first question. So Svetlana, would you go first?
Sure, thanks, Natalia. And hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers and of this fantastic workshop panel, and then to everybody in attendance. And another very important thing, following Natalia's comments, I think it's fundamental and essential to say a few words about the ongoing violence that is unfolding in Ukraine right now. And this has been going on, this violent attack orchestrated by the Russian government has been going on for more than a month. It has taken, disrupted, and affected millions of the lives of millions in the region. And I would like to say that I condemn this invasion and stand in solidarity with all the victims of the war in Ukraine. And additionally, I also think that connected to what Natalia said, disability studies, in fact, has a lot to say and a lot of tools to to help us comprehend this particular moment, as well as the scope and nuance of violence and effect that it has been inflicting in the region. So I'm really excited and happy to think with the toolkit of disability studies about the present moment too. Going back to Natalia's first question about what brings me to study disability, and I'll just give a brief introduction of what I do and who I am. I am an anthropologist by training, so I use ethnographic methods to study disability inclusion programming practices and discourses in Russia. More generally, I came to this topic being interested in how bodily and mental differences bring people together or apart, how some differences are marked as significant, and while others become completely disregarded, insignificant, and not mattering. And disability, as well as various forms of impairment, have been very consequential differences in the region that I study, which is Russia. The stigma attached to this difference has been drawing people apart for a long, long time, and we need to pay attention to how this apartness has been done, and what kind of disablement has been done by this kind of apartness. And in the past decade, since Russia signed into the UNCRPD, there has been a discourse and orchestrated attempts to address this apartness, this stigma attached to disability. And so there have been this calls to destigmatize impairments and change the discursive cluster about disability, or invalidnost, the word in Russian, altogether. And so I'm trying to understand what is happening here. How this is done by different stakeholders and different participants, starting from disability activists themselves to governmental bodies or various privately organized campaigns and NGOs. How do they try to challenge this really long-seated stigma attached to disability and this naturalized exclusion that has been practiced and done in Russia for a long, long time? And I'm just in wrapping up, I'd say that in my research, disability appears in really many shapes and forms as a lived experience of both people living with impairments and disablement, as a moralized metaphor, and as a marker of political subjectivity. It's also appears as a link to the global political subject and then global discourse of disability rights. And also as a key disability appears as some sort of a key to local histories, as well as component to public fantasies about what a bright and modern and good future is, as well as a component of nostalgic creations of the past, of what disability used to be, what disabled people could and could not do during the Soviet time in particular. I'm just going to wrap up here to, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Ina, would you go now?
Yes, thank you very much, Natalia. And I'm very grateful to be part of this wonderful discussion and start of the project. In connection with these tragic events in the Ukraine that are going on these days, I would only like to note that they again show how much disability studies and studies more broadly of care and vulnerability are needed in Bulgaria, for example, because we here again show a very strange preferences in our public focus and discussions. And we argue publicly in the public space more about Russia and about who is pro-Russia and who is against it, than, for example, about the refugees and people with disabilities that are coming our way, and this wave of vulnerability that is nearing our borders. Concretely about your question, the first two questions, I decided to share a memory which answers this question, what brought me to the study of disability. This was a personal experience 13 years ago, and it shows the absolutely normalized rejection of disability in Bulgaria. And I experienced it during my first pregnancy 13 years ago, when there was a higher risk for having a baby with Down syndrome. I was told that it is very likely to have such a baby. And I was shocked then for the first time in my life to see how unproblematic the selective abortion was conceived to be, both on the part of the medical professionals and on the part of everyone around me. And the genetic counselor framed it as a double bad luck, firstly for the Down syndrome as such, and secondly for having such a child in Bulgaria. He said something like this: being born in Bulgaria with a disability adds additional layers of disablement on top of disability itself. Since then, I could say that maybe I can describe the way disability operates in my research in a similar way. I'm trying to understand what are these additional layers of disablement that are locally produced, how they were produced, what are their histories, and in what they are currently rooted. And maybe most importantly, why they do not provoke collective action and do not sustain collective action and some kind of resistance locally.
Thank you very much for sharing this really personal story with us, and thank you for bringing and stories of resistance, and I hope to return to this further. Would you go now? We're keeping the alphabetical order. I don't know if she can hear us. Maybe there's some camera problems and mic problems. these are quite.
Sorry, is it my turn? Because I didn't hear
yes.
you.
Yeah,
okay,
yes,
sorry,
I wanted to go in an alphabetical order.
Okay, sorry. Should I turn on the camera when I'm speaking or not? Because
if you feel comfortable, that would be nice, but there is also no obligation.
Aby kliknąć ten przycisk, naciśnij uruchom wideo.
If you prefer, I can turn it on. Okay, so first of all, I would like to say thank you for your invitation. I'm really honored to be in such a prominent group of researchers. And in the second place, I also would like to express my solidarity with the victims of this Russian aggression in Ukraine. And I agree with you and with others who said that I think it's extremely important to speak about disability now, about disability perspective, because all this humanitarian crisis shows that disability is extremely sensitive issue in such situations, because there are also, of course, refugees with disabilities, and there is huge problem with reception of them now in Poland, because this all this infrastructure, which was constructed completely grassroots, of course, because Polish government doesn't give its attention to this issue, wasn't prepared for reception for receiving people with disabilities. So I think it's very important time to speak about it. So I'm really glad that we have this meeting now, and we have started this project now. But coming back to your question about disability, my interest for disability studies and disability in my research. So first of all, I would like to say that I'm a blind person myself. But I have never thought that I would focus on disability issue in my research. When I was a student, I thought, when I met someone with disability at academia and researching some disability issues, I thought, oh my God, it's so boring. When you are disabled, you have to study disability, nothing else. And I was like, I would like to be normal. I would like to study normal things. You know, I'm not only my disability. I don't have to focus on it. That was my my attitude in the beginning. And I hold a master's degree from psychology and from Spanish philology. And I have to say that psychology, I thought it was a big mistake. After the first year, I really started to hate this this faculty and all this career, and much more. And Spanish philology was much more interesting for me. But of course, I have to finish psychology, and that was the first time when disability appeared in my research, because I decided, okay, I hate it, so I would like to do something kind of easy. So probably the easiest thing for me will be to study disability, because I have kind of big experience in it. And I conducted my first research related to disability, because it was something about the blind students, comparing blind students in Poland and blind students in Italy. So I had to explore disability from the theoretical point of view, and for the first time I heard about models of disability, the social model, the medical model, and so on. But after that, when I finally finished a master degree in psychology, I left this and I focused on Spanish philology. But then when I few years later, when I decided to do a PhD, and I was thinking, what can I do? And I was looking for the subject. Totally by accident, I found out that something like disability studies existed. And I thought, oh, I can do research in it. It will be interesting for me now. And I applied for this PhD program, which is it is called Nature and Culture, and it's very wide, but disability studies fits in somehow. So I proposed my disability studies proposal, and it was accepted. Since I hold degree from Spanish philology, and I did my master thesis about Mexico, I thought, okay, I would like to do something related with disability studies in South America, because it's not really explored cultural region, let's say. Here comes the answer for your second question: how does the disability operate in my research? Reading all this, American and British articles and literature about disability studies, I found out that it is usually focused on stereotypes. I mean, how do non-disabled people represent disabled people, how stereotypes are reproduced, and so on. Generally, kinda depressive and negative vibe. And all, for example, in literature, in literary studies, disabled characters are represented as passive and, like instrumental, treated. And I thought, oh my God, it doesn't have to be like this. I mean, there are some positive sides of disability also. I would like to explore this. And I remember when I read Narrative Processes by David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder. I don't know if you are familiar with that, but it's about literature, disability studies. And I thought that it made me furious, really. I mean, of course, all the stuff that they write is true, but I thought we have to look for some positive patterns about disability also. And reading Latin American literature, I discovered that like disabled characters there are not always passive and sad and more rebel or something like this. And my main thesis is that disability can be interpreted as a resource, and this is how generally disability operates in my research. I look for signs of using disability as a resource by artists, basically writers and other kind of artists in Mexico, but in other countries also. So this what interests me basically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I hope we can later, if we have time, to think what kind of theories or crip activisms from other parts of the world, not necessarily Eastern Europe or Western Anglophone world, also help us think about disability. But I also would like to hear from Kateřina.
Yeah, I want to join in with thanking and expressing appreciation for being able to share the floor and meet you again. And I do wish that we had a more joyous background to your conversation. Again, trying to stand in solidarity, but really not knowing what it means and what it entails, really. So I think that is really, I want to acknowledge also that this war so close and is letting us speechless and really at loss for what is the what would be the solidarity and what does it mean to express the vulnerability of the refugees coming and how to help. And that is bringing me to something that Ina said, and Ina pointing out how in Bulgaria the war is seen through the framework of Cold War, we are with or against Russia. This is also happening in the Czech Republic. And along with that, or alongside this axis, that is also really interesting to see the different approach of the Czech society to the refugees, where the Czech Republic really rejected refugees or even rejected to see people fleeing the war as the refugees, very often arguing against the quota and seeing them as sort of quote unquote, the economic immigrant, as if that was something less valuable to provide help and refuge. there is a huge solidarity. There is a really unprecedented wave of collective organizing, organizing help and support. But this comparison between how the Czech Republic reacted to the other forms of war that are happening, have been happening, is, I think, against what disability in sort of a larger framework can help to answer, and points to this sort of ideological and political distinction of value of lives, and what lives are seen as to matter, and what lives are soliciting solidarity and empathy and sort of forms of affective relations that is then helping to provide for life of the people that are in danger. So this is something that is really coming through as quite remarkable, as well as what I think already Monika has pointed out, that you don't see much space open for allowing to actually conceptualize that people coming from the war will be disabled, that will be disabled in many sense of the world, people coming with having disabilities before and needing to flee the war, but also people being disabled by the war, coming affected by the violence of the war. And I think the public discourse so far is really focusing on, like, we need to help, but also the people, they really do want to work. They will really not be dependent on the social welfare and social benefits that the Czech Republic will offer. But in the majority, or in the dominant discourses of streaming through the public space, really do not really acknowledge that we need to make space and allow the people that will come and seek refuge to live through the hurt of the war, and that they will need support and assistance with that, but also need space to mourn and live through the hurt and come to that. So that is, I think, something that will be really important, and there we need to potentially push to allow for this space. And now, on a more banal note, when you ask me, how did I come to disability studies? I did actually sit down and try to imagine. The only origin story that I have is really, really problematic and incorrect, politically incorrect, and really, but I do want to stay with the moment of, so I was coming across, I wrote, my dissertation was looking at queer narratives of subjectivity in 19th century. But reading through queer theory, you did have to stumble across the sheer amount of recognition of the AIDS crisis and the amount of work devoted to AIDS crisis. And I really did not, stupid me, naive me, I really did not understand. And I was irritated, and I did not know, and I could not appreciate it coming from the Czechoslovakia. I am a child of state socialism, where AIDS has not been really a topic. I was really irritated, and I did not understand. And I think this moment of not knowing, not understanding, has been something that and trying to find how to relate, how that applies to many things that I was encountering in the life, has something that I think brought me to disability studies. And this is sort of I am embarrassed by that moment, but I think that is an important to acknowledge and keep it. This is also how I started to write my book about post-socialism, because I did not understand how the translation of disability theory, as I was encountering in the Western academia, is not really happening in the Eastern European space. So this sort of moment of not understanding, being irritated, was there always. How does disability operate in my research? This is a really difficult question. I think the only quick response that I came up with, I just
the first question was supposed to be easy and just like opening,
I know.
But it seems that it was both banal and difficult.
No. I think it was a fun question, but it's also very, generous and encompassing a lot. So I just come from a teaching. We were discussing intersectionality and intersectionality methodology, and I think this resistant imaginary, like disability studies, as leading or is sort of helping us with a lot, or providing us with sort of a resistant imaginary, is I think where I would point, searching for a short answer. two short examples, because I know we are pressed for time and we need to move on. But this, what I mean by resistant imaginary. So in my book on looking at the post-socialism and the post-socialist transformation in the Czech Republic, I have encountered, and I lived through, actually, I came of age, so to speak, when these narratives were blooming and really taking on politically and ideologically, is that, you know, we have conquered state socialism and totalitarianism, and now is the free world, democratic world for everyone. So I am trying to write up a resistant imaginary to this narrative of inclusive, open democracy, and that is actually allowing everybody to come to their rights and world in the space, in the world. So I sort of try to map up spaces of chronic neglect, abandonment that cannot be imagined and cannot be written into these narratives of post-socialist transformation and social betterment. And I think I can leave the second example out, so we have more space for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. The second question was supposed to be Anglophone disability studies, and I sent out the questions earlier, so you know what I wanted to ask, but I think we will change maybe the order slightly and actually think about activism and resistance right now. It seems to me more maybe pressing in some sense. So how, you know, like I've been doing disability studies for a number of years now, and I've been active in some sort of activist groups, but the word did leave me speechless in some sense. And at the same time, Eastern Europe has been a location, I think, of disability activism now for some time, right? In 2018, there was a huge occupation of the parliament in Poland done by disabled people and their caregivers. There were protests in Czech Republic in 2018. There were protests in Bulgaria. So these are again two questions packed into one, which I know shouldn't be done, but I will still do it. First of all, how do you see relationship between disability activism and disability studies in Eastern Europe right now? And maybe more having in mind Ukraine and everything what's going on, how does disability studies offer us a toolkit? I think that's the word that Svetlana used, or if I'm actually wrong, please correct me later. Does it offer us any sort of toolkit how to think, how to resist, how to act today in Eastern Europe as disability scholars and activists, and some of us are people with disabilities here. So yeah, I don't know, Ina, would you go? You mentioned this collective resistance in the beginning. So
okay, thank you. I will try to to say something, although it's a very huge and very difficult question for me, at least. So when discussing disability studies and its relation to activism, or discussing, for example, the more narrowly the social model as a base on which we can base our struggles in Eastern Europe or in Bulgaria. Concretely, for me, the question is about the direction of FIT. Of course, the question, as I already said, is very complex and can be framed in many ways. But I'm trying to find, for me at least, the answer of this way of posing the question about the direction of fit. Which side should be flexibilized and made fit to the other? the theory or the, as I said, the social model to the different contexts, for example, the local, the Bulgarian one, or vice versa, the context and the practices to the key tenets, for example, of this social model. And when the context cannot be made to fit these key tenets, how this could be explained, because I think this is the situation in Bulgaria during the whole period of the transition, for example. So should we blame the theory or the rigidity of the local reality, and how to make the lives of people with disabilities better, in which should be the final aim or purpose. For example, key tenet in disability studies and activism is the idea that the voices of the disabled people themselves should be heard and not appropriated or silenced. And in Bulgaria, traditionally, this is not the case. Or if it is, it happens rarely and not for all disabilities. The model that predominates in Bulgaria is the spokesperson's model, if I can use this phrase. Always there are someone else or some other institutions and social actors that are speaking on behalf of people with disabilities. And this was the case even when these protests, which you mentioned 4 years ago, took place in Bulgaria, and they were called the Mothers' Protests. They were initiated and led by mothers of children with disabilities, and practically they were not supported by organizations that are run by people with disabilities themselves. So for me, this is one of the key issues locally, how to implement the tenets of the social model, or it would be better to transform or shift some elements in it in order to fit the local context, which obviously is quite rigid.
So in some sense, the two are incompatible?
Yes, the experience shows that they are incompatible, and the social model could not be embraced locally.
Thank you. Svetlana, would you, because I already sort of, mentioned you saying that you used the word. Now I'm not sure if that's what you did, so you can correct me, but also please, you study activism in Russia, so yeah.
Yes, I did use this word. So, and I've been thinking about it since for a while, of course, for clear reasons. And I think that for me, there's so starting with the toolkit kind of aspect of the question, I think we can really turn to the questions of Jasbir Puar has this very helpful concept of that I think is very useful at this moment, and this concept is making populations available for injury. And making available for injury preserves the intentionality of incurring violence. And when I'm thinking about the Russian government incurring violence, for me the moment that is this moment demonstrates that the violence has so many various vectors and directions, starting from direct military assault to the political suppression and increased, really intensified policing of its public sphere domestically, And it makes me pose the question, what has this government been historically, who has this government been making historically available for injury, and for what cost? Because we can think about bringing acute violence, which is with the example of which would be militarized attack on the civilian population in Ukraine right now, as well as slow violence, the violence of depletion, the violence of exhaustion, the violence of underfunding, and as well as the immobilizing the tools for self-advocacy and as well as expressing political dissent in one way or another. So these forms are also forms of violence, albeit they're slower, they're more insidious, and they emanate from the same center, and they're informed by the same kind of logic of we can borrow here even Mitchell and Snyder's concept of able nationalism, this kind of overlap of profound ableism and sort of this form of nationalism that has been inflated to this imperial kind of, that has mobilized for this imperial project that is it's now undertaken. And I think that thinking about kind of how this able nationalism deploying itself globally and domestically simultaneously is something that is making me think really deeply these days. And speaking about, and sort of if we turn to domestic activism, because this is what I've been studying mostly, we can see that there's not sort of nothing new, and nothing new in a way that we, for so many years, we have observed the profound depoliticization of disability activism. And what I have seen during field work, as well as kind of what I've been observing after I left the field, is that those projects that would be labeled as so-called social activism, something that is perceived to be non-threatening to the political project of basically of the Russian kind of dominant of the Russian kind of propaganda, of Russian dominant political line of thinking. So those projects that would be perceived as non-threatening, mostly labeled social, mostly social, either economic, would receive some support. And yet those who would be perceived as threatening, as trying to employ and rely on on the more conventional forms of political protest, such as public protests on the street, or expressing very clear kind of criticism, they would be highly policed, and they would be made impossible. And so I think that this is nothing new. And I think one of the questions that you sent us was what helpful tools do we have actually to think about various forms of activism in the region. And one of the ways is, I think Maria Cristina Galmarini has been working on the concept of activism under state socialism. And she was looking into blind activism and thinking about what is activism when it is not deployed in a liberal agora that is safe, for people to go out on the street, and that is where protesters guaranteed at least basic security and safety. And then and instead she was working with the Soviet period with activism that was mandatorily made in cooperation with the ruling elite. And I think that this is really something that we really need to think really deeper about. And I understand that these days this is probably a specifically Russian context because of the kind of the increasingly authoritarian and kind of monolingual, monovocal political sphere that doesn't tolerate any kind of politically articulated arguments and activism. So, but we need to think about kind of and to look into what other strategies people are using to disrupt this in ways and means that are available to them. Does this mean if you cooperate and if you use governmental funds, does this mean that this is not activism? And I'm not saying that I have actually answers to this question, but I think that this is another kind of area where disability studies focused in the region of Eastern Europe can tell us a lot about what disability activism can look like when we're not dealing with the protected sphere of liberal democracy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for bringing up Jasbir Puar and this phrase available for injury. I wasn't sure whether I should bring up a different border that Poland has with Belarus, and I think I will do now. I think most of you probably know what is going on there right now, but I will just briefly say that since at least August of 2021, if not earlier, refugees from Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Congo try to enter Poland, and some of them possibly go further west. And Poland, together with Belarus, relies on a strategy, on a technique called pushback, right? That both countries are pushing them, and that they are trapped in this death zone, basically, and they've been dying there now for months. And these are refugees that Poland does not recognize as refugees. This becomes right now, seeing what's going on in Ukraine, we see that not everyone deserves to be called a refugee in Poland, that it is a highly mobile or flexible category, which is being manipulated because the official discourse is that people who try to cross the border with Belarus are called usually migrants. But this is actually the population which is available for injury, right? This is, if we think about disability and applied disability studies, especially the right to maim, the state gives itself a right to maim this particular population, which is also a process of disablement. I mean, it's very difficult to imagine that if anyone survives pushbacks, that they will be still, that they will be non-disabled. They will be very much disabled. And we know that at least some of these people are already disabled. And that's in many cases the reason why they try to get to Europe, to access medical services. But also the pushbacks create disability, of course, and this is population available for injury. So in that sense, it's very difficult for me to think about one border without thinking another border right now and enable nationalism, and who's being folded into it and who's not folded into it. And but I don't know what to make of it further. So I will maybe ask Kateřina to help me to think about activism and disability studies and this disability studies toolkit.
Yeah, I think a lot of important stuff has already put on the table, and just to follow on from what already Ina and Svetlana have mentioned. So very often, so speaking from this context, but I think it's not specific to the Czech context, disability activism is sometimes actually seen as opposition to disability studies, and I find it as a very problematic tension or exclusionary locations, precisely for what you already talked about, and that is access to activism, not only what is seen as activism. Like Svetlana talked about how certain forms of agency in a public space are perhaps not seen as activism because they have been in some form of alliance with the state and or institution of the state, but also the new work that is coming and talk about bad activism, forms of activism that are actually not happening in the public space or happening through different forms of creating coalitions, creating a collectivity that then has a different voice and different agency. I think this is something that would be really interesting and very important to translate into the Eastern European context as much, because there are many ways in which access to activism is being barred. And interestingly, it seems as though contemporarily, as in contrast to, for instance, earlier 90s and the work that Sarah Phillips has done and who will also be speaking today, it seems that it might actually become even more troublesome and more problematic to become engaged and keep up the activist work that we have seen in the earlier 90s and live through today. And one of the access to one of the issues why certain forms of activism might be not accessible is not only that they're happening in a public space, but that also the forms of, and that still many people live in institutional settings from which you cannot really go and strike in the streets, is also the politics of respectability that is ideological barrier to activism. Again, like Svetlana has come to that from a different perspective, but as much as it's difficult to organize your sense of self and public identity around the notion of disability, then it's difficult to come and create activist actions that would also offer themselves to a broader coalition. So what you see very often is, and I think Natalia, you talked about it in the Polish case, is that some forms of disability activism are positioning themselves in competition to other forms of social exclusion and abandonment. So, and then you are creating this sort of respectable subject that deserves a recognition, that deserves to be rated in the position. And I think this is really troublesome, and that is actually firing back and recreating, entrenching the social divisions and social inequalities. And so in that sense, I do believe that it is part of the ally work of disability studies when it's done by non-disabled people or people that are perceiving themselves as non-disabled, to actually help or create assist to move the public discourse so that even protesting and activism becomes more accessible in relation to the structural barriers, but also to the ideological barriers. So what forms of collective organizing is that we see as activism, and who can access those forms of collective agency is, I think, something that comes up when we think about disability activism, and how can people actually become activists when they cannot access assistance that would allow them to live independently and get out of the institutional curatelle. So I think in that is important to keep and cultivate the connection between the theory and the practice as they push each other.
Thank you very much for this comment. Yeah, in Poland there has been no deinstitutionalization, and it has been a huge rallying cry, but nothing. I mean, politically they say they've been doing something, but nothing actually has materialized. And then I think Monika, she is both a scholar but also an activist. And if you could just add something to, how do you see the relationship between disability activism and disability theory in Eastern European setting?
Sure, I can share with you my experience, and maybe more than theoretical reflection, because as you said, and as I mentioned, from the scientific point of view, I don't investigate Central Europe. But first of all, I have to say that in my experience, disability studies and disability activism are strongly connected, because it was since when I started investigation in this field, I became much more aware as a person with disability, or as a disabled person. Because I was brought up with mother who is not disabled, and she always was trying to bring me up as a regular person, ordinary person. I didn't go to a special school. I didn't have disabled friends and so on. And she always was like repeating me that you can do whatever you want and you can achieve whatever you want. But on the other hand, she also repeated me, you have to always be 10 times better than the others because, you know, you are disabled. So but if you will be exactly the same, nobody will hire you, for example. So you have to have some advantages, additional advantages, right, to be treated equally. So this is the more or less the context in which I grew up. So I never thought about myself. Of course, I knew that I was disabled, but I didn't define myself as a person with disability, right? And I started to think about it, to think about my disabled identity when I started when my interest for disability studies started. So it helped me, like in inquiring disability studies theory, this models of disability and so on. It helped me a lot develop my awareness, my self-consciousness about disability identity, and made me thinking about activism in this field, and made me thinking that, okay, I have to do something because it is my business, actually. Because before I thought, okay, I mean, I'm not disabled, I don't have really big problems, I can live with all I have. It's not my business, right? I will not go out to the street and protest for some additional money because I have good life and I don't need this additional money. And then it made me thinking, it made me feeling like a part of this community and kind of responsible for other members of this community, because I understood that I was kind of privileged because, you know, I have a very good social background, I have very good cultural capital, I come from a middle-class family, I have higher education. My education was never under discussion. It was obvious that I would go to the university, and it was obvious that I will have normal life. But since I started this interest for disability studies, I understood that it isn't a very common situation, and I understood that it is kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't like to be too pathetic, but it is kind of social due that you have to pay. I mean, you were gifted, you are privileged, so now you have to do something for the others. So that's why I think disability studies is very important for development of activism, disability activism. And my personal experience, I would like to share with you two aspects of my activism very briefly. One is related to accessibility, because mostly I'm in Polish context, sorry. I'm interested in the accessibility, especially accessibility of culture. I used to work in an NGO dedicated to accessibility of culture. I still collaborate with some institutions in this field. So this is my main activist area. But another area was last year related to women protests in Poland. Maybe some of you know, maybe not, that last year Polish government introduced some changes in abortion law, and it is almost banned now in Poland, and Poland has the most restricted abortion law in whole Europe. And there were huge protests against it, and of course the disability subject appeared, because usually the pro-life narrative says about, you know, children with Down syndrome as an argument against abortion, right? But nobody speak about these children after birth, you know, the most important for our government, for these activists, is to bring them to the life, but nobody cares about them after. So there was huge disability activism speaking, okay, giving life, okay, but what you gonna do after with this life, right? And another thing is that women with disabilities also protested, saying that, you know, women with disability are also women who sometimes need abortion. And it was very controversial theme, connecting, you know, disability, women with disability with this abortion issue. And I was very active in this street protests. Of course, it wasn't as hard as in Russia, but some of you mentioned, I think Svetlana, you mentioned this Russian context, that street protests are extremely unsafe. Of course, it's a little bit better, but really it was also very hard. Last year, these protests were very brutally crashed down by the police. We were, you know, there was physical violence against us. We were like dragging on the pavement by them, and so on and so on. And it was, in my opinion, it was very important that there were women with disability visible there. There was me with my white cane. There were my friends with white canes. There were our friends on wheelchairs to show that this discourse of disability and abortion is not just, you know, one question. There are so many questions related, and it's very, very complex. And we were against using us as an argument in this discussion, right? Because people with disability were just used as an argument. And it was about being subject or being object of the discussion, and being a participant, active participant of the discussion. Because surprising or not, people with disability can have very various, you know, world views, and they can be pro-life and they can be pro-choice, and it's really worth to draw this picture of variety, of diversity of our community also. So yeah, it's very brief. I mean, I said it would be brief. It wasn't. I'm so sorry.
Okay. No, thank you. That was, I think, really, really interesting, and I think those examples speak really well to the way in which disability activism and disability studies strengthen each other in Poland, at least. I wanted to talk to you. I mean, oftentimes, I think, as disability studies scholars who work on Eastern Europe, we position ourselves, or we are positioned vis-a-vis so-called Western disability studies or Anglophone disability studies. Is there any merit, do you think, in saying that there is, you know, Anglophone disability studies vis-a-vis Eastern European disability studies? Or should we maybe say rather global disability studies, or just disability theory? Because in some sense, ideas travel, right? We do not create we do research, but we don't do it in some sort of vacuum. And I think I read all of yours, at least papers or parts of books and so on and so forth. And we rely on theories, or we are in conversation with theories which have been developed in different, in this so-called Western or Anglophone context. So yeah, so that's a long introduction to this question. Is there any merit in this sort of geographical labeling of disability studies, and then positioning ourselves I don't know whether that's in opposition when we say Western disability studies, or do we mark that we are in conversation or in dialogue? We probably do many things depending on a context, but how, guys, do you see this? And I want to start with Kateřina, who's just about to publish a book on disability studies in Czech Republic, which is in very much, I would say, in conversation with this Anglophone.
Thank you. I mean, it's a very, and thank you for letting me open this discussion. It's such a broad question and there are so many different answers. So
I know, I'm sorry.
And I think you actually already started providing very good questions. Like our answers depend on the context in which we speak and what we want to say, what is the sort of like politics or agenda of what we want to say. Also, I think we can push against the notion of Anglophone and Western disability studies as if they were monolithic, as if that was actually one canon. And I think it would help us to also speak about the tensions and conflicts that there are between this sort of disability theory developed in the UK and Scandinavia, France, Germany. They are very different. They all engage in different epistemological tradition and methodologies, and they do actually provide a different sort of framework. But not speaking about, even though as much as I am really happy to see and try to participate as much as I can in this sort of so-called transnational turn in disability studies, that is actually, there is a very concerted effort to get out of the epistemological center and lend ear to or engage with theory that is coming to from global south, or, you know, again, locations that are politically marked and that are constructed as political, as global south or as Eastern Europe. I think we need to acknowledge that knowledge is power, and the way that knowledge is produced and distributed is always in alliance with political and power legacy. So I do believe also that it is important to speak about the East or the knowledge production in disability studies that is coming from Eastern Europe, as much as, because it not only frames a different historical experience, but also because when we look at the knowledge production in Eastern Europe, we actually see that powerful tensions in power and epistemological power. So I'm just referencing a book that some of you have been participating in as co-authors, the Reimaginations of Disability and State Socialism, that I co-edited with Martina Winkler, and that is trying to map the legacy, this sort of a different epistemological tradition coming from the state socialism and coming from in the Eastern Europe developing epistemological framework of defectology, and a different take on what could be named as disability theory of disability rather than disability studies. But interestingly, and I think Maria Galmarini has already left, but she also writes about how in the 90s or after the turn, after the fall of the state socialism, there is actually epistemological conflict and fight over what sort of knowledge production, what knowledge framework is being used. And it does, I think there is an importance in trying to think the way that a disability theory from the West is being translated in Eastern European context as a part of much broader political and power reorganization of the Eastern European world. So I'm going off here or building on the work of Lisa Lowe that is rereading the stories of democracy together with rereading the stories of colonialism. So the questions that we then would be posting is, what did the theory, disability theory translated from the West did in the Eastern European context, how it was actually connected rather than disconnected or in opposition to the market relations, the power reorganization that happened in the Eastern European context that actually affected disabled people in very ambiguous and very complex ways. And I think this is, so in that sense, I do believe that in that context, it has merit to talk about the Western disability theory and actually look why in what constances it did push against and why did we actually discard all the knowledge that has been assembled over the decades under state socialism, even though again, very problematically and very in a very limited but interesting way, different than social model of disability, actually has been talked about distinctions between the state of your body and the way that society allows you to live a valuable life. And so again, that is, to me, that is a question of what was made possible and what was made impossible. In what sense, actually, in some the translated disability theory from the West, that it also is translated in very specific ways. So the ways of translation is creating new meanings and new emphasis and new sort of assemblages of knowledge and the themes that can be brought up and themes that are not necessarily so visible. So what, for instance, did it mean that the translation of certain streams of knowledge production that we understand as Western have put emphasis on identities and respectabilities and emancipation, and what it meant actually in intersectional relationship to other forms of marginalization and abandonment that was happening to Roma people, that was happening to other social marginalized groups that are never seen as allies or and sort of in proximity to disability critique. So these are some of my answers. Sorry for being rather lengthy this time.
No, that's great. Thank you. And thank you for pointing out that I think oftentimes in Eastern Europe, we say that this is not a monolithic region, right? But neither is the so-called West in some sense, and disability studies is not monolithic there as well. And I think that it's important to remember about the politics of translation, how things are being translated and even what's being translated, because not everything. So who's being translated by whom, and also in what sort of political or cultural context, right? Who does the publishing? And I wanted to ask Svetlana, because she is based in this so-called West, working on Eastern European stuff. So
thank you, Natalia. Yes, and this is a very big and a very important question, I think, because this addresses the questions of decolonization of academic knowledge altogether. And well, we need to kind of, so I'll start from the beginning. First of all, I think that when we just say disability studies on the one hand, in the ideal world, to me, it would signal kind of an inclusive field of inquiry that would come from various contexts, whereby the category of disability would be thought about, contested, debated, and so people would, academics or authors or speakers would engage in some sort of like a conversation or a dialogue. Now, we also live in a world that is not organized along this equal lines, and having been part of European academia for a little bit when I was doing my master's education in Belgium, then having been a part of the US academia and having seen Russian academia from during my research as well as during my undergrad studies, I can tell that there are dramatically more resources in the Anglophone academia. And we need to account for this, because more resources mean I truly think we need to really speak about it, because it's not only the question of what gets translated, it's also how much research gets funded, whose voices get to be amplified, and whose voices, because of that, have just more are more supported, are louder, and who can afford doing research and teaching, and who can afford just doing teaching. And then so these are all questions that I think we really need to take into account when we think about disability studies as a field that is not just like what we want it to be, but what it actually realistically is. And I think we really truly need to create more real opportunities for not only sorry, I'll begin again this sentence. Real opportunities for various kinds of research that is conducted outside of the well-funded Anglophone academia and create real opportunities for people with other under-resourced backgrounds to make use of these funds to enter the dialogue. And we see this calls for decolonizing kind of disability studies for a long time. We've seen it in, I think it was early 2010s, Helen Mikosha published this article about decolonizing disability. We see kind of critiques about the concept of disability and disability studies for it being too white, for it to be relying on basically the kind of a middle class American identity. And I'm talking about, of course, the kind of the body of text that I've been exposed to. So please forgive me if I'm overlooking some important contributions. We see that this has been kind of these calls have been put in place, but I do wonder how much resources were put to enable this to actually happen. And another kind of, and I also wanted to bring to echo what Kateřina was mentioning about that disability studies is not monolithic, and it's truly is not, because even within the US, I would say, the kind of this initial universalization of kind of one context and one idea of what disabilities has been contested by research that comes with people who have low income, who don't have any security networks and safety nets to even access activism, as Kateřina was saying, or access the very world in which disability can be viewed as a source of value. And so in this way, I think that it has been happening, and I think that there has been really calls for conducting intersectional studies of disability and experiences of people living with, around disability. But I think that one very important thing that needs to happen is also the kind of the material support of these calls, and the enablement of funds for scholars who are not located within the Anglophone academia to actually conduct this research.
Yes, in some sense, that's a question of access, right? Who can do disability studies in Eastern Europe and in other locations? Thank you. And I wanted to turn to Monika, who's working on Mexico. To what extent even those divisions, Western, Eastern European, do they even make sense when you look at disability via Mexico?
Of course, this division between Western and Eastern Europe doesn't apply in Mexican context, but if we look at this question in wider context, I mean, as you said, Anglophone disability studies versus global disability studies, it's really relevant because I think we can all agree that disability studies are dominated by this British and North American perspective. Most of concepts that we use were coined there, and it's natural consequence of this, but our research is dominated by this perspective. But of course, there are some interesting, one of you mentioned that there are totally different approaches in Germany, in Scandinavia, in France, and the same is with Spanish-speaking area, because it's not only South America, but Latin America, let's say, but also Spain, because the Spanish-speaking research is very related one to each other. I mean, Spanish research done in Spain is really related to what is happening in Latin America, because, you know, of course, of the common language, there's very vivid intellectual exchange still across the Atlantic Ocean. So what caught my attention when I started to investigate this theme was the concept of a functional diversity, which was coined in Spain a few years ago, and it was it was promoted as a substitution for the word disability. And I didn't find it very used in Anglophone text. I mean, I found it once or twice, but it's not very common concept in English, in text written in English, but in Spanish text, it's very common use. Diversidad funcional, functional diversity instead of disability. People with functional diversity, for example. 2 years ago, I went for Erasmus to Spain, to Madrid. I studied at Complutense University, and this office which is, for example, in Poland, it is called Office of People with Disabilities at University, right? Which is supposed to support students with students and also employees with disabilities. There it is called Office of People with Diversity. And it was very surprising for me to discover that there is so influential concept coined out of Anglophone academia. And it's kind of commonly used also in Latin America. I think it might be related to this thinking of decolonization. I think, Svetlana, you mentioned about this need of decolonization of disability studies, and that some regions are looking for their own language. It is also related to this question of translation, right? And of course, each of this region that we mentioned is Eastern Europe, Spain, Latin America, Scandinavia. We have all very different experiences. I mean, like social experiences, political experiences across ages, but especially last century. Functioning, like, for example, labor activity of people with disability was totally different in socialist states than in UK or in the US. So, we have very different approaches to some issues. So I would say, a little bit answering to your question, that I don't like using this division of like Western disability studies, Eastern disability studies. I would say that we have one disability studies, or like one disability theory, which includes some principles like, models of disability, norm, undermining norm, and so on, like exclusion, violence, discrimination. It is common experience for everybody, but we have very, very different understanding or definition of these key concepts. And there is one disability theory maybe, but there are variety of perspectives, and we have like Eastern perspective, Western perspective, South American perspective, which is very loaded with colonial and post-colonial meaning, for example, which is usually absent in European context. So I would vote for using this variety of perspectives.
Thank you very much. And so I think Ina is the one who hasn't talked yet. And after, once Ina wraps up, there will be short Q&A because we are running out of time. And I think prepared like 9 questions, but that's the of it, that we are running out of time. And so Ina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will very briefly just add one risk of when we are labeling disability studies a Western product or Western stuff that I recently discovered that risk is working here because I saw the reactions of my students, and it appears that now in the local Bulgarian context, introducing disability studies in this way have the potential to undermine the legitimacy of the field, at least to some extent. And this is due to the populist right-wing wave that is gaining momentum in Bulgaria, and not only in Bulgaria, of course. And we all very well known that its main targets are all the Western forms of the so-called liberal interference, and the notion of gender is under attack, women's liberation, and human rights. And this is in fact deprives now in Bulgaria many disability activists of the narrative of rights as a tool in the struggle against disablism and stigmatizations and so on. So now we must be obviously very cautious when how we introduce disability theories and disability studies in Bulgaria, because it carries this risk of being identified as a Western attack against the authentic Bulgarian national values and family, as the narrative goes.
So are you saying that disability studies is at risk of sharing the fate of gender studies, for example, in Poland or in Hungary?
Yes, I think that at least to some extent this is true, and it can have the fate of LGBT movement, all these liberation movements that are seen as Western and foreign to our authentic values.
Thank you for this. Teodor Mladenov wrote on chat, and I will just read it. The roots of the, in quotation marks, British social model are in anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa via the experience and work of Vic Finkelstein. Thank you for the reminder. And Vic Finkelstein, of course, was involved in the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation in the UK. So I know that we are a little bit past the time, but thank you so much for everything you have said. But if there are any questions, please do ask them. Magda did allow for a very short Q&A. Or share a comment on there. Oh, Madia wrote in the chat box, what role do you see history of disability in Eastern Europe might play in engaging with these myths of authenticity? I think that Ina just mentioned. If anyone wants to respond to that. The history of disability, in a sense, protect, right? Is disability studies from the attack of.
If I can make a comment live, sorry, since people are thinking, do you mind?
No. You can also ask, that's, I didn't say it, but you can totally ask questions in the chat box, but also just, you know, join in and speak to us.
Okay, and I'm gonna put myself out there to be viewed so that I'm participating in that way as well. So Natalia might know that in the back of this question is the project that I'm engaging in with Natalia and several others, and I very much hope that we will continue to build on what I'm starting and what we're starting together. But my thinking about the kind of stuff that Ina brought up and the connections with gender studies, and this kind of accusation that may be leveled against disability activism regarding being a kind of an import would be to, frankly, look into histories of things like what religious establishments in the past, how they conceptualized concepts of, normalcy, belonging, exclusion, so-called charity, right? And how those kinds of histories that connect to claims about authenticity, right? And national belonging and all that in many places in Eastern Europe, I mean, all the ones that I know of, how that focusing on that might actually help us develop a kind of social mirror for those who mythologize about the importation of these concepts as being not so much foreign imports, but rather necessary tools for really making sense of these histories, the institutional development of how people with disabilities have been treated over the past, not to mention, in my work, for instance, the medicalization of disability via eugenics, which was incredibly powerful and very popular in interwar Central and Eastern Europe. And so to me, it seems like history, although it's not about the present in a direct sense, but it might have some really direct relevance for developing a kind of a context and also arguments vis-a-vis these claims to authenticity and to the kind of essence of perennial traditional family and the nation, which I see as being imbricated with questions of able-bodiedness and gender, always, and race, of course, and ethnicity.
Thank you, Maria. So maybe while you are gathering your okay, Svetlana, go.
I'm just going to advertise the work of Maria Cristina Galmarini again, and because I think it actually is very fitting to this question, and the work that her book her second book that she's been working on, and that at some point soon will be out, is on the international activism of blind people living in various states under state socialism. And we see that the history of that activism, international activism, shows us very well that, first of all, there were no impenetrable borders, that there has been exchange and flow of ideas, technologies of support, technologies of activism, across the kind of the divide of the world, the socialist and the capitalist bloc. So there has been this flow, and that kind of challenges the very kind of idea that those two, for example, were somehow separate, essentially different, and we also, and it kind of shows us how this cultivated discourse of authenticity and contained kind of uniqueness and difference is very much constructed for oftentimes for political goals, and it in fact disregards a lot of movement, a lot of exchange, a lot of kind of mutual pollination that has been happening throughout history. And so, yeah, I wanted just to bring up that Maria Cristina Galmarini's work on that I think is very helpful to think about this question.
Thank you, Svetlana. So we have a question from Alina, and this will be probably the last question, and then we will have a break. So Alina, please go ahead.
Yes, first of all, thank you for the great event, and thanks to all presenters. Maybe my question is a little bit stupid, but do I understand right that in Poland, Bulgaria, there are some, not classes, but there are some departments like disability studies, because when I tried to find something I'm a PhD student. I'm doing my research on disability studies. But when I tried to find some university in Europe where are some programs like disability studies, most of them were in Great Britain. Of course, there was in North America, United States, or in Canada. But did I understand right from the presenter's speeches that there are some kind of such programs in East Europe? Because for me it was surprising. Or it's just like some classes, or it is just like part of subjects such as anthropology. For me it was a little bit messy, and I would like to know a little bit more. Thank you.
Ina will speak for Bulgaria. I will just say quickly about Poland. There are no disability studies departments. There is, I think, one at the Academy of Special Education in Warsaw, but I think I and my other colleagues who are here, we all teach disability studies. As you said, as part of, I teach that American Studies department, then Magda teaches media studies. So no, there at the University of Warsaw and at other universities in Poland, there's not a single disability studies department. And I think that's in some sense in connection with what Ina said about gender studies. Do we even want to open those departments and to receive a little corner in the end of the hall? Or is it, you know, different strategies or mainstreaming? But no, that there isn't a part, except for this one at the Academy of Special Education in Warsaw, which is one school. And Ina, would you talk about Bulgaria?
I can be very brief about Bulgaria. We have no department or or faculty, of course, and we do not have even a course anywhere which is called disability studies or something mentioned in disability. I'm teaching, in fact, disability studies under the guise of bioethics and applied ethics and stuff like this. So we do not have absolutely that is bearing this label in Bulgaria, unfortunately.
Sorry, yeah, that is also the case for Czech Republic, but from a different perspective. Actually, I think it's interesting to see what programs will use the sort of denomination of disability studies in the future, because it has been a path of re-legitimization of certain more problematic projects of rehabilitation or special pedagogy. So I think there are study programs in disability studies popping up. I am not, for political reasons, I'm not speaking specifically about Czech Republic, but there is also a different question that you need to consider when we are looking at are there or are there not programs in institutionalized in disability studies, because the institutionalization always brings a certain politics with it and a political agenda. So that is a different perspective on the question asked.
Svetlana, would you like to add something or?
I can't really comment on the Eastern Europe, so I can only speak about the US, but I think the question was about Eastern Europe.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you to all panelists for your great inputs and insights, and thank you all for bearing with us. And yeah, Magda, would you like? I believe that we are having a break now, but I want to confirm this.
Yes, thank you so much, Natalia, for bringing us here with all these great questions. And thank you, Kateřina, Svetlana, Ina, and Monika for providing us with your thoughts and reflections. It was really great to participate in this discussion. And well, we invite all of you to our next meetings. As I said, they will take place monthly, on a monthly basis. Next month, the seminar will be organized by Dubravka Zima from Zagreb University, and in May, Todor Mladenov will be our organizer and host. And in June, Monika Bar. So I think that there is a lot of interesting things ahead. Now we would like to invite you for something like 10 minutes break, and at 6 o'clock with slightly later than planned, we'll start the workshop that will be hosted by Sarah Phillips, and we will be mapping Eastern European disability studies. So please join this very room in 10 minutes. Thank you so much for your participation and your time, Friday time. Thank you.